Right, we're recording. Welcome to class today. It's Friday. Little fuzzy screen. I think it's all right. Okay, so we'll pick up on our lecture. I think I've got the assignment due today, right? Okay, if you want to go ahead and pass that forward, I'll pick those up. Those of you online, you can upload on Blackboard. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Thank you. Thanks, well. Chloe. All right, let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. So last time we were going through some examples of hedging, and we started bringing some basis into it. I'm going to move this, you guys can see. All right, so we started bringing basis into it, and basis is the difference between cash, your local cash price, and futures price. All right, so what if cash is not equal to futures? We're on slide 19, and this is the case of bringing a basis in when basis isn't zero. So it's the difference between cash and futures aren't always equal as they were in the previous examples, and most of the time they are not. And right now they're long ways from each other. We'll talk some more about that. It can be positive or negative, and basis has seasonal trends. So basis equals cash minus futures, and can be positive or negative depending on the demand, so the location, and a lot of times, or in the past, we've seen positive basis for corn in western Kansas because that's where a lot of it's used. Right now, I believe it's even negative there. Basis has seasonal trends. It's generally weakest at harvest, and it strengthens throughout the storage season. Basis information and knowing something about basis is critical. It's critical if you're going to be a producer or if you're running an elevator. It helps you as a producer, for example, evaluate forward pricing opportunities. So as we talked about earlier, you have the ability to forward price your grain right now for next year. So say the next year's wheat harvest, you can lock in some prices now. You can do a forward contract with your local elevator. You can hedge. You can do all sorts of things. You can go with options, buy a put option. You can do basis contracts. You've got a lot of different options. And I guess that's the point of this class, is kind of to show you all those options and help you understand how you can evaluate those. So is the forward contract that my local elevator is offering me for next year's harvest, is that a good one? Is it reasonable? Or could I do better hedging it myself or going some other route? Also, basis information is critical when you evaluate grain storage decisions, which right now there's people storing grain. I would guess most of it's unhedged, and which may or may not be the thing to do. I guess time will tell, but one thing we do know is that on average, if you don't hedge, you're going to have more risk, more price risk. So some can handle that, some maybe not. All right, so just a little bit on basis. Factors that determine basis or affect basis: transportation costs or location. So this is probably the most common one, and the easiest one to understand is that if wheat is used in eastern Kansas or Kansas City or Tulsa or somewhere other than western Kansas, and we know the Kansas City wheat futures contracts are based on delivery to Kansas City, then it would be reasonable to expect the price of wheat in Hays or Dodge City or Goodland to be less than that in Kansas City because it's used in Kansas City. So we need to truck it there. So if someone's going to buy grain in Dodge City, they're going to pay less for it than they would for wheat in Kansas City. So think about a wheat buyer in Kansas City. So transportation costs or location affect basis, local supply and demand conditions. So there can be times when a certain area has an increase in demand, a spike in demand for something. Maybe the ethanol plants they're increasing production, or maybe a new one went in. They come in, they increase demand in that area, which affects basis. It strengthens the basis, raises the cash price, buying price in those areas. Or maybe there's a abundance of grain in a certain area. Well, that can have a negative supply, and that's kind of what we're going to see in places this harvest. In many cases, these elevators are packed full. I just read an article today about how the amount of storage space in the country is the amount of available storage is the lowest it's been since, I don't know, the 80s or something. So we've got full elevators. So are they wanting to buy a lot more? Probably not, and that's going to be reflected in basis, lower cash prices. Quality variation from underlying futures contracts. So if you've got low quality product, wheat, corn, whatever, it's going to sell at a discount beyond what maybe their advertised cash price is. Or if you have some high quality, high protein, whatever, could increase that. Availability of substitutes also. A lot of these ethanol plants, they can run on corn or milo. And so there's a trade-off there. Same thing with feedlots. They can feed wheat if the price gets to a certain level. They can, there's some nutritional concerns and changes probably that have to be made, but they can substitute wheat in for corn in the livestock rations. And that can all be transferred back into basis. A little bit of basis lingo. I've already used some of these terms. I think this little figure here shows it pretty well. When the basis becomes positive or less negative, we say that's a strengthening basis. So think about that just a little bit. When it becomes more positive, so if basis goes from positive 5 cents to positive 15 cents, that's becoming more positive. So that would be like on this left hand side here. If it's going from positive 5, here's 0, 10, 20, negative 10 and 20. We're at positive 5, we're right in here, and we go to positive 15, we're strengthening. It's becoming more positive. Or less negative. If basis becomes less negative, we would say that's strengthening. So if basis went from negative 20 down here to negative 10, it's a movement up. Negative 10 is more than negative 20. More, it's less negative, I guess what we would say. Then that's also strengthening basis. If we say basis is getting stronger, it's moving up, which can either mean becoming less negative or more positive. On the other side, if basis becomes more negative or less positive, we'd say that's a weakening basis. So if we went from positive 20 to positive 10, that's moving down this way, that's weakening basis. Or if it goes from negative 10 to negative 20, which is becoming more negative, that's also a weakening basis. This happens when cash prices, so a strengthening basis happens when cash prices increase relative to futures prices. Remember, basis is the difference between cash and futures. Cash prices decrease relative to futures prices, we would say it's weakening. And I know that might seem like a lot of information right there, but as we start putting it into examples, I think it'll start making sense. You'll start seeing how farmers, producers who are hedged would rather have a stronger basis, which really what that means is it's a stronger cash price. And buyers, long hedgers, would rather have a weaker basis. So we'll see that in a little bit. Just a little on basis theory, because it's so important, because that's, as you'll see here in a little bit, the hedges that we're going to look at really depend on basis, and what basis ultimately ends up at. We need to understand a little bit about what affects basis. So this is, let me see how many of these I got. Okay, so 3 points, which is, we could probably spend a whole half a semester talking about basis theory and really trying to figure it out. But cash and futures prices must move generally in the same direction over time. So this is saying that cash and future prices don't have to be the same. We don't expect them to be the same. We don't expect the price of a futures contract for delivery in Kansas City to be the same as the price of wheat in Hays. We talked about that. We don't expect that, but over time, they should move in the same direction. So if one goes up, you'd expect the other to go up, and vice versa. And typically, we see that. All right, so now we're going to go a little deeper here and talk about convergence. During the month in which a futures contract matures, the price of that futures contract and the cash price at futures delivery points must come reasonably close together by a fairly predictable amount. Okay, so what does that mean? During the month in which a futures contract matures, so the December corn contract, we talked about, that's the harvest month contract for corn. It's the most heavily traded one. It's one that people look at most intently. So we've got the December corn futures. That contract's going to mature in December of this year. We would expect the price of that futures contract and the cash price at futures delivery points. So Chicago is a delivery point for the Chicago corn contract. We would expect Kansas City is a delivery point for the Kansas City wheat contract. We also talked about how you can deliver to Salina or Hutch for a discount, but let's ignore that for now. And maybe let's go with the wheat example, since it's a little closer to home. And let's look at what's the harvest month for the wheat contract, futures contract? July. So if you're going to hedge your wheat production, you're going to use the July contract, so July 17 contract. So let's say the July 2017 contract is going to mature in July of 2017. We would expect the cash price in Kansas City, which is a futures delivery point for the Kansas City wheat contract, we'd expect the cash price at a local elevator there to be reasonably close to what the July Kansas City futures contract kind of finishes at in July. That's called convergence. Those prices should come together. If they don't, then people should deliver on their contract. If, for example, a local Kansas City elevator co-op or whatever is offering $3 a bushel, and the Kansas City futures contract, the nearby one, so like the July one, is trading at $4. There's a dollar spread there. Anybody in the Kansas City area ought to quickly sell a July Kansas City wheat contract and then deliver on that. They make $1 a bushel. And so that's arbitrage seeking. And so enough people will do that it'll bring the prices back together. They'll converge. And very closely related to that concept is this one here. For hedging in areas outside of futures delivery points, the movements of the cash price in the delivery and non-delivery markets during the delivery period must reflect a fairly predictable difference over time. So what this is saying, I can use this example of Hays. We're saying that when the contract matures, for example, let's assume it costs 30 cents a bushel to haul wheat from Hays to Kansas City. We would expect then the July contract in July, when it's coming to maturity, that it ought to be close to that 30 cents a bushel. Otherwise, people will want to deliver on their contract if it's something more. If the price of wheat is 50 cents higher in Kansas City than it is in Hays at that time, people will say, I want to deliver on that, and they'll make 20 cents. It's going to cost them 30 cents to get there. So that won't occur for very long, and it'll get back to a fairly predictable difference between the two, and that difference primarily would be what it costs to transport it. So I say all of this to let you know that basis isn't something that's just random. There's actual theory behind it. There's actual economic principles at work, and really it comes down to there's arbitrage seekers. People are trying to make money, and when they're allowed to function in a market, it makes these things hold true over time. And so there's people that really understand basis, and you need to really understand basis if you're going to be in this business. And because it's somewhat predictable, because there's economic reasons behind it, means that we can use it to hedge and lower our risk. In other words, I would have more confidence in trying to predict what basis is going to be at any given time for a given location than what cash price is going to be. Cash price, there's a lot more complex factors at play there. If you ask me what the wheat price is going to be next year in Hays at harvest time, I would not feel very confident at all in giving you a prediction on that. If you ask me what's basis going to be in Hays next year at harvest time, I still couldn't guess that with any certainty, but I'd come closer. I would say on average, I'd come closer to guessing that than I would just overall cash price. That makes sense? Forget about all this for now. Let me just restate that. If you ask me what the cash price of wheat in Hays is going to be next year at harvest time, I would not have much confidence in estimating that. I'd come up with something, but there's a good chance I'd be a decent amount off. And if I did this every year, I wouldn't be very accurate. But if you ask me what's the basis going to be next year in Hays at harvest time, I still couldn't guess it with 100% accuracy. I'd come closer to guessing that than I would cash price. And that is very important, and that's why hedging works, because we're betting on basis, not price. And you'll see that. So I've got this up on the slides many different times. This is one you need to be able to know like the back of your hand. Basis equals cash minus futures. So you can rearrange this, and a little bit of background noise in here. Cash equals futures plus basis. So if we solve for cash, you add futures to both sides, you get cash equals futures plus basis. So I just solved for cash in that top equation. So cash price is a function of futures and basis. What hedging does is locks in futures, but not the basis. And I'm going to go through some examples coming up here real quick. And so some of these things may not make sense to you right now, and that's fine. I would encourage you to go home and look at it again at some point. But once we start going through examples, I think then you'll be able to come back to these slides, and these will really make sense. So we're gonna do that here shortly. Actually, let me see. Okay, we're ready to go to an example right after this one. Basis is quoted relative to some futures month. So you could call up any elevator right now and say, what's the basis? And they're going to give you a number. And they may say 40 cents under or $1.20 under. And if they don't specify, you can assume they mean they're going off the nearby futures. So if you asked them what's the wheat basis right now, and they said $1.20 under, what you would assume, if they didn't tell you anything else, you would assume they're talking about current cash price. So cash price if you deliver right now minus the December wheat contract. Whatever December wheat is trading at, that would be your basis. Same thing with corn. You call Midland Marketing up and say, what's your corn basis right now? That's 35 cents under. Okay, thanks. Well, what do they mean by that? 35 cents under. Whatever their cash price is right now, it's their current cash price for corn delivered right now today minus the December corn futures contract. So whatever December 16 corn's trading at. So we can quote basis relative to other months. We can talk about deferred basis and all of that. We'll do that later on in the semester. But right now, all we care about is the nearby basis, which is your current cash price minus your nearby futures month contract. Okay, let's go through an example now. So we spent a lot of time talking about basis theory, the principles behind it. Talked about that it's somewhat predictable. Now let's throw basis into a problem. Okay, so it's November 6th. This is the same problem I think we went through, except slightly different numbers. It's November 6th. We plan to sell wheat at harvest in July. So we've got our wheat in the ground. It's looking good. We want to protect that. We want to lock in a price. And so that's why we decided to hedge. And to do that, we need to sell a July wheat futures contract. And let's say it's at $8.80, which would be unbelievable. But let's just go with this. The numbers, value, or levels don't really matter here. Okay, now we're going to fast forward the clock. And now, so we fast forward it, 9 months or something like that. And we sell wheat locally at $8.70. So the price of wheat in Hays is at $8.70, and the July futures contract happened to be $8.80 at that time. So we sell wheat locally at $8.70, buy it back for $8.80 on the board. Basis is 10 under. I probably shouldn't have thrown that up there. It would have been a good question to ask you guys. So where do we get this? Basis is 10 under on July 1st. Well, local cash price minus nearby futures. 870 minus 880 is -10. So what is our net sales price? When we're all said and done, how much did we sell our wheat for? That's the real question. 870. That's right. And so how'd you get that? Okay, there you go. What's that? Yep, exactly. So there's a couple ways of figuring it. You can do it a quick way, and 880 plus a -10 is 870. That way works great. It's maybe not quite as logical as maybe looking at it this way. Okay, I sold my wheat for 870 locally. So I sold to Hays Co-op for 870. Okay, 870 cash. And then the question is, how do I do on this futures transaction? So we have a cash market, we have a futures market. In the futures market, I sold for 880 back here, and then I bought back at 880. So I came out zero. Didn't profit or lose any money on that futures transaction. So my net sales price is 870. And there's two different ways of looking at that. Cash price of 870, there's no proper loss on futures, so it's 870. Or there's two, this is one way of calculating your net price, this is the other. 870 equals futures plus basis. So 880, this futures price, what you initially sold at plus the actual basis. 880 plus a -10 or -10 is 870. Okay, now we're going to look at what the price changes, which it most certainly will. So we won't have that 880 and 880 like we did here. Okay, so next example, we're planning to sell wheat in July. It's November 6th. We want to lock in a price. So what do? We sell July wheat futures at 880. That's what the market's trading at that day. So we sell for 880 on July 1st. So I'm fast forwarding the clock. We're harvesting now. It's harvest time. We're pulling across the scales, dumping our truck, and the price is $8, cash price. So I sell for $8. I buy back futures for $8.20. What's basis on July 1st? 20 under. So it's cash minus futures. So it's $8. So if I ask what's basis at harvest time, and we're assuming July 1st is harvest time, it's cash price minus futures. $8 minus $8.20 gives you negative 20. 20 under. So you can say 20 under, or you can say negative 20. So what is our net sales price? $740. No. So how'd you get that? Not 740. Oh. I just went the wrong way on one calculation. So I hear it. Someone saying it. 860. So you can think of it two ways. There's two ways to calculate the net sales price. Probably the most logical way, intuitive way, is to say, all right, what did I sell cash wheat for? What did I get the check from Midland Marketing for? How much per bushel? 8, exactly. So you got $8 from them. That's what happened on the cash side. So I got $8 per bushel in my pocket. I got $8 in my pocket. How'd I do on the futures side? Made 60 cents. How'd I make 60 cents? Right. We sold high at 880 and bought back for 820. If you sell something for 880 and then turn around and buy it back for 820, you just made 60 cents. So I got $8 from the co-op cash, and then this futures transaction I had over here made me 60 cents. So when I put those two together, my net price is 860. So the other way to figure it is by looking at 880 here, taking your initial hedge price, your futures price, for 880, and adding to that the actual basis. And you already told me actual basis ended up being 20 under, which is negative 20. So if you take 880 plus a negative 20, that's the same as 880 minus 20, which is 860. Basis 20 under. Cash price of $8. And you made 60 cents on futures, so we got 860 or 880. I don't like, and I did it here, I say 880 minus 20, which gives you 860. But probably to be more correct and maybe to prevent confusion in the future problems, most time I'll say it's 880 plus a negative 20. Because I want you to remember you take your futures plus basis. So 880 plus 20 under. So 880 plus negative 20 is 860, which is also 880 minus 20. But if we have a positive basis, which we could have, I don't want you subtracting that from it. That should be added to it. So as we look at this, can anybody start to tell, well, first of all, so I'm going to try and tie several of these concepts together. Is this a long hedge or a short hedge? What we did on November 6th, would you call that a long hedge or short hedge? Short hedge, because we sold. We sold in the futures market, so this is a short hedge. So we're a short hedger here. As a short hedger, would we rather have a stronger basis or a weaker basis? We had a basis of 20 under. Would you rather have 20 under or 20 over if you were a short hedger? What's that? There you go. Got to be the other one, right? And the reason that is, we can work through the math. I can show you about at least 2 different ways why that's the case. But if you remember this, our net price equals futures plus basis. Our net price was 880 plus a negative 20, which gave us 860. If we would have had a 20-cent over basis, it would have been, what would our net price have been then? 9. Yep. 880 plus 20 plus a positive 20. So it'd be $9. So a stronger basis is what we want as a short hedger. Long hedger, which we'll go through later, it's the opposite. They'd rather have a weaker basis. We lock. We locked this 880 in on November 1st or November 6th. So that we locked the price in, the futures price we got locked in with our hedge on November 6th. So, and then our basis was realized on July 1st. So as a hedger in this example, I mean, ultimately all we care about is our net price. We don't care ultimately what we made in the cash versus on the futures. We just care about when you put them all together, what I end up with getting for my wheat. That's what really matters. Once you lock this in on November 6th at 880, the only thing you care about from that point on is what's this going to be? What's basis going to be? And I just said if we're a short hedger, we're hoping that it's stronger. And the stronger it gets, the better off we are. The weaker it gets, the worse off we are. And so we lock this in. This is the only thing we're subject to, the only uncertain component of all this. Yes, we need to grow the wheat too, kind of ignoring that fact. We can talk about insurance and things like that, so let's ignore that. But once we lock this price in, this is the only thing we care about from that point on as far as determining our net price. And so going back to what I was talking about 10 minutes ago with the basis theory, all that was to tell you that we can kind of predict basis, not with perfect certainty, but we understand what goes into basis and how, if the market's allowed to work, we can kind of predict what it should be. And over time, it is somewhat consistent. So we can look historically, what's it been in the past. This year, as I said, is kind of throwing all that out the window. Hopefully they'll get the problems fixed for in the future. But this is all, the only risk we have is basis risk. What's basis going to end up being? But basis risk is less than overall cash price risk, which would be the alternative, one alternative to going with a hedge. Okay, so this is putting it all in a table, and I'm going to draw a lot of these tables throughout the rest of the semester. So if you're kind of having trouble following through it on those PowerPoint bullets, this is the way I prefer to do it. And I'll be doing this throughout the semester. So it's called a T-chart diagram. We've got our date over here on the left, cash market, futures market, and basis. So we have those 4 columns. And then we have the different dates when we actually made some transactions, either on the cash or futures. So what I might show you first, okay, so actually, there we go. Let's ignore this one and this one for now. Okay, so let's look at what happened here. On November 6th, what did we do? Well, you can go back a slide and you can see on November 6th, what was the move we made? Transaction we made. Right, sold July futures. Do that. Let's see. Okay. So yes, we sold. If you go back a slide, I'd have to stop annotation, take a little bit. You could go back a slide and see on November 6th, we sold July futures and we sold it at 880. So that's what I wrote right here in this cell of our table. Sell July at 880. So we call our broker up. Want to sell July contract at 880. Kansas City wheat or whatever. Okay, so that's the only thing we do, and then we hold tight till harvest time, marketing wise. And on July 1st, we harvest our wheat. We're hauling it to town. We go across the scales and we say, sell it. Sell it cash. It's at $8 right now. I want to sell it. So we sold it for $8. So we get $8 per bushel. That's what this one here is showing. Notice that's in the cash market column. So on July 1st, in the cash market, we sold for $8.80. What do we do in the futures market? Well, we need to offset. We talked about offsetting. If we don't offset, well, we might have to deliver, and we don't want to deliver grain to Kansas City or Salina or any place like that. So we offset. What do we offset at, or how do we offset? We have to buy that contract back. We sold initially. Now we need to buy it back to offset. So we buy the July contract, and it happens to be trading at $8.20. So that's what this one here shows. Basis is the last column over here, and basis is what? What's the formula for basis? What? Cash minus futures. So notice I have these in a certain order. Cash minus futures equals basis. So that's supposed to be a minus sign. Cash minus futures equals basis. So $8 minus $8.20 equals -20. So it's this $8 here minus that one equals that one. $8 minus $8.20 equals -20. So that's all the information we need. Now we just need to do the calculations to figure out what our net price was, our actual realized sales price. You can do that two ways. First way is to say, what I do in the cash market. As Mesa said earlier, we sold for $8 in the cash market. Okay, that's what happened in the cash market. How did I do on the futures market? Futures transaction. I made 60 cents, right? That's what this here is showing. Gain of 60. Why'd you make 60 cents? Because you sold for 880 and bought back for 820. You sold high, bought low. That's a good thing. So you made 60 cents there. So you sold for $8 in the cash market, made another 60 cents in the futures market. Put those two together, you effectively got $8.60 for your wheat. And that's what all this is showing down below. The other way, less intuitive way perhaps, is to say, what do I do in the futures market initially? Well, I sold for 880. What did basis end up being? -20 or 20 under. Add those two together, 880 plus a -20 is 860. So that's the second way of calculating it. You get the same price. I like both ways. This way I like, you can really see that once you do this in November, once you sell at 880, you're hedged. So you've locked in that price, that futures price. So from that point forward, the only thing that matters to you in terms of your final price, your net price, is what's basis going to be. And here it ended up being -20. And you can also see that if that was stronger, that would be better. So we're at -20. That's what it actually ended up being. What if it was -10? Is that stronger or weaker than -20? Stronger, because it's less negative, going back to that picture that I showed you. So it's a stronger basis. If our actual basis was -10 or 10 under, what would our net price have been? 870. So the stronger basis would give us a stronger price. This was -10, then this would end up being 870, which I'd rather have 870 than 860. So stronger basis helps the short hedger. So a lot of things going on here. I know this can be very confusing, and hopefully I'm kind of tying it all in for you. The whole idea, that figure that I showed you with stronger and weaker basis, and that all kind of works itself in here. And the reason why basis is so important. It's important for everybody, but especially a hedger. Because once you hedge, that's the only thing that matters, is what's this going to end up being. And we can somewhat predict this. Not with 100% certainty, but we have some idea what basis might end up being. I've ignored, let's see, might as well just go with a different color. Maybe, there we go. So I've ignored this one and this one here. I've ignored those because we'll bring it in later, but I think it maybe makes it a little more confusing at this point. But just real briefly, what it is we can come up with our expected cash price in July by looking at what basis or what the futures price is and adding to that our expected basis. So here we expected basis to be 20 cents under. And where do we come up with that? Well, I might look at the previous 3 years. What was basis at harvest time in Hays during each of those 3 years? Take an average, and maybe it was -20. So that's where we came up with that. So you don't just pull those out of the sky. You don't say, I expect it to be -50 or whatever. You look historically what it's been, and that gives you an idea of what it should be. And so that's what that one there is for. All right, let me see. I think that's a good place to stop. I would encourage you to look back at this over the weekend. We're going to have an assignment coming up where you're going to go through a lot of examples like this, and it'll hopefully drive it home. If you have questions, you're totally lost, whatever, please come and see me, shoot me an email. Have a good weekend. We'll see you next week. Hey, yep.